You're watching ABC 7, New York.
And welcome back to New Jersey Viewpoint. I'm Sade Bedouinois. In the early 60s, New Jersey Congressman Neil Gallagher was a power player and close friends with the Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King Jr. The story of his downfall is a lesson on civil liberties and the topic of a new book. With us today is Ron Felber, the author and the privacy war, who is also a New Jersey resident. Thank you very much for joining us, Ron.
My pleasure.
Ron, tell us, what is the essence of this book?
I think it's a kind of cautionary tale. The story of Neil Gallagher, who was a decorated war hero, 3 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star Medal, a presidential citation, coming to Congress along with John Kennedy, and finding a horror story, finding that people are taking polygraph tests without the knowledge of even the agencies that are sponsoring it, finding that psychological testing is being given to grammar school children, and that those tests wind up in a dossier, a computer data bank, on every living American citizen from cradle to grave, that blackmail is prevalent, that the House caucus room is bugged by the FBI, that many of the senators, including Hale Boggs and others, prominent ones, were being blackmailed by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. He said it was like waking up one morning and discovering that America was a myth, that he'd fought the Nazis, re-upped, by the way, 40% disabled for Korea, a true patriot, came to Congress expecting to see a sort of a shining house on the hill.
And that didn't happen.
It was incredibly corrupt, and J. Edgar Hoover, in large measure, was behind much of it.
Mm-hmm. When you started writing this book, and we're looking at a picture now of Neil Gallagher here, did you always know that this is going to turn out to be a fictional book?
Well, when I first started, I wanted to do a fiction book on the Kennedy assassination. It always intrigued me because maybe like a lot of people, everybody sort of remembers when John Kennedy was assassinated. And everybody, I think, felt unfulfilled. And so I wanted to investigate that, and I did. Studied the Warren Report, etc.
And were you surprised what you started to get into, what you began to find out? Absolutely.
When I walked into Gallagher's home, on his piano top were pictures of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. And I said, do me a favor, Neil, don't put my picture on your piano top. Mm-hmm. And he said, why? I said, because every one of them has died a violent death. There are about 9 figures. And he said, except you, I said. And he said, no, I'm dead. They just didn't do it with a bullet.
Hmm. Tell me about Gallagher. What was his lowest point?
I think Neil really, Life magazine, which was an organ of the FBI essentially, a fellow named Sandy Smith was doing reporting from raw wiretaps given to him by Roy Cohn and others, who was an intermediate for Hoover, on enemies of the FBI. They did 3 exposés that linked him to the mafia, to a fellow named Joseph Zigarelli, who was a capo in the Bonanno crime family. And I think his lowest point was when he found out that he'd been under investigation since the privacy hearing started, that Hoover, through Cohen, was asking him to use the privacy hearings to go after Robert Kennedy and to blackmail Robert Kennedy. And when he refused to do it, he became an enemy of the state.
And that's when his life began to spiral downward.
Spiral is a euphemism. Mm-hmm. It plunged downward.
And walk us through that for those who haven't read this book, really on how Gallagher began to really fight for this issue of the 4th Amendment and how it played so heavily in his life.
Well, I mean, Neil is an idealist, and he believes in the Constitution like I think most of us do. And he was deeply troubled at black bag jobs, which were FBI break-ins, illegal break-ins to his home, for example, to rifle through files.
Yeah, there were, you mentioned in the book, there were first 2 or 3 officers that showed up in his driveway, and then there were 9, 10, 15, 16 just going through his belongings.
Unbelievable. But that happened not just once. That happened during the 60s, then it happened in the 70s. But basically, once your name gets in
that's it.
A kind of bad list, it doesn't go away. And really, he's been a man that where prosecution turned to persecution over a course of about 30 years.
And how much time did he ultimately serve?
He, again, here's a fellow that was a highly decorated war hero. Here's a fellow that served with some great bills. He sponsored the Peace Corps. Peace Corps, along with Shriver, was his idea. And he wound up serving 2 years in 72, and then again in 96, went back, both for income tax violations. But the Life magazine articles accused him of things like gun running, money laundering, mafia ties, even having a dead body in his basement. And ultimately, the way they wanted to use the blackmail was to publish that this fellow died, a gangster died in his bed with his wife.
Was he ever vindicated?
Yes. The House Ethics Committee vindicated him in the 70s of the first charge. The grand jury vindicated him that they had no evidence. And then finally, the ultimate vindication came when Roy Cohn, who was the FBI go-between in those days, when Roy Cohn on his deathbed wrote a letter to Rick Gallagher saying that it was all made up.
Let's get in here, balancing the Fourth Amendment right also with things like post 9/11. How do you balance that, and how do you end up covering that in this particular book?
Well, you know,
what is that fine line?
I'm not so sure it is a fine line. People like to think it's a fine line, but it's like the fine line between right and wrong. You know, and I know, that it's wrong for a government to break into the homes of citizens illegally. You and I know it's not right to wiretap people. The way things are going these days with the Patriot Act and such, these basic constitutional rights, for example, the ability to see a warrant and know your house is being searched, that's gone. You will not know that your house was searched. And by the way, if your neighbor happens to see a break-in, the neighbor, under the Patriot Act, can't talk about it.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We've run out of time, but the book, again, is called The Privacy War. Check it out. You cover a lot in here, a lot of history.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm Sade Bedaran Wan. We thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.